It started with a document, not a leak, not a whisper, not a headline screaming for attention. A document, filed quietly, logged, time-stamped, the kind of thing that sits in a system for days before anyone realizes it matters. And that's the first contradiction. Because when people hear the words celebrity and lawsuit in the same sentence, they expect noise, chaos, flashing cameras, someone storming out of a building with a statement clutched in their hand. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This was none of that. This was procedural, which raises the uncomfortable question we're going to sit with for a while. Why does a routine legal filing suddenly pull a global figure into a seven-figure financial dispute? And why now? At first glance, it doesn't look dramatic. No allegations shouted in all caps. No emotional language. Just numbers, clauses, dates, signatures, the kind of paperwork that usually stays invisible to the public. Until it doesn't. Because buried inside that filing was a figure large enough to stop seasoned legal reporters mid-sentence. $2.3 million. Not a net worth estimate. Not a brand deal. Not a donation pledge. A disputed amount. And once that number entered the public record, everything changed. Now, before we go any further, something matters here. This story is not about declaring guilt. It's not about rushing to conclusions. It's not about turning a legal process into a morality play. This is about understanding how high-level financial disputes work when they intersect with fame, power, and reputation, and why the mechanisms behind them are often more revealing than the accusations people assume. Because here's what most headlines won't tell you. Large financial institutions do not rush to court. They stall. They negotiate. They exhaust every private channel available. Litigation is expensive, public, risky. So when a case reaches a courtroom, it's usually because something has already failed behind the scenes. That's what makes this filing different. And that's why it matters right now. For years, the public narrative around Meghan Markle has been tightly controlled, carefully curated, fiercely defended. Supporters see resilience under pressure. Critics see inconsistency. Everyone sees a figure who understands the power of optics. Which is why this moment feels off. Because credit card disputes don't operate in the realm of branding. They don't care about speeches, awards, or carefully worded interviews. They are governed by contracts, by authorization rules, by transaction logs, cold systems, unemotional systems. And those systems don't respond to image management. They respond to documentation. So when a lawsuit linked to a credit account allegedly connected to Meghan Markle appears, the real question isn't, what did she do? The real question is, how did a private financial relationship escalate into a public legal dispute at all? That escalation is where stories like this live. And that's where things get complicated, because most people assume credit card disputes are simple. Someone spends, someone doesn't pay. Someone sues. In reality, elite accounts don't work that way. They involve authorized users, business expenses, foundations, staff, advisors, proxies. Money moves through layers. Responsibility becomes shared. And accountability becomes flexible. Until it isn't. And when it stops being flexible, the consequences can be brutal, especially when timing enters the picture. Because this filing didn't surface in a vacuum. It didn't appear during a quiet period. It arrived amid broader conversations about finances, transparency, and credibility surrounding the Sussexes. That timing alone raises questions. Was this dispute brewing for months? Years? Was it recently triggered? Was it the result of a breakdown in communication? Or something more structural? Those answers aren't in the headlines. They're in the fine print. And the fine print tells a story. Slowly, what we know so far is limited, but telling. The case involves an American Express account. That matters. American Express operates differently from other card issuers. Their relationships with high-value clients are more personal. Their dispute resolution processes are more layered. Their tolerance thresholds are higher, which makes escalation rare, not impossible, just rare. So when escalation happens, it signals that internal resolution either failed or was no longer possible. And that's where things start to feel uneasy, because if this were a simple misunderstanding, it likely wouldn't be here. If this were a minor discrepancy, it would have been corrected quietly. Instead, we have filings. We have figures. We have a timeline that doesn't quite line up. And we have silence. No immediate denial. No explanatory statement. No clarification. Silence in legal contexts can mean many things. Sometimes it's strategic. Sometimes it's temporary. Sometimes it's enforced. But silence always creates space. And in that space, questions grow. Questions like, who is authorized to spend? Who is responsible for oversight? What category did these charges fall under? Personal, business, organizational? And perhaps most importantly, who flagged the issue first? Because disputes of this size don't erupt overnight. They build. They accumulate. They sit unresolved until someone draws a line. The moment that line is drawn is often the moment a private disagreement becomes public. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Now, it's tempting to frame this as scandal, to jump straight to conclusions, to assume intent where complexity is far more likely. But that's not how responsible analysis works. Responsible analysis looks at structure, at incentives, at systems. And the system here is financial, not emotional. Which brings us to a subtle but crucial distinction. A lawsuit is not a verdict. A disputed amount is not a conviction. But a filing is not nothing. It is a signal that something broke down badly enough to justify formal action. And that signal becomes louder when the person connected to it has spent years emphasizing transparency, ethics, and reform. That's the emotional contradiction at the heart of this story. Not accusation, and contradictions are powerful because they force audiences to pause, to reevaluate, to ask uncomfortable questions, like this one. If everything was above board, why did it reach this point? And if everything wasn't, why now those questions don't have answers yet? But the path toward those answers runs through documents, timelines, and decisions that haven't been fully examined in public yet. Because the filing is only the beginning. What comes next depends on how the parties involved respond, and whether more information enters the record. And historically, once document surfaces, others tend to follow. That's when patterns emerge. That's when narratives shift. That's when stories like this stop being abstract and start becoming specific. But before we get there, we need to slow down. We need to understand how disputes like this form. Why institutions like American Express behave the way they do, and how fame changes, but doesn't eliminate, financial accountability. Because the most revealing part of this case may not be the number, it may be the mechanism. And that mechanism begins with one deceptively simple question: who, exactly, was authorized? And who is responsible when that authorization became disputed? Because when we answer that, everything else starts to come into focus. And what comes into focus next is the filing itself, and inside it, a detail that quietly changes the entire trajectory of this story. The filing didn't announce itself. No press alert. No coordinated rollout. No sources close to the matter, lining up quotes. It entered the system the way most serious legal actions do. Quietly, almost politely, a sequence number, a date, a jurisdiction. A clerk doing their job. That's important, because noise usually comes later. The first thing seasoned court reporters look for in cases like this isn't the name attached to the filing. It's the structure, the posture, the way the language is shaped. Because lawsuits have personalities. Some are aggressive. Some are defensive. Some are written to intimidate. Others are written to preserve options. This one, according to those who have reviewed the publicly visible portions, reads as measured, procedural, almost restrained, which immediately raises a flag. High-dollar disputes involving global financial institutions rarely open with theatrics. When they do, it's usually because the filing itself is intended as leverage. This didn't feel like leverage. It felt like escalation. And escalation is what happens when quieter attempts fail. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what comes before a filing like this ever sees daylight. Behind every lawsuit is a paper trail that never makes it to court. Emails, phone calls, internal reviews, transaction audits, dispute notices, grace periods, especially with elite clients. American Express, in particular, is known for absorbing friction long before it externalizes conflict. Their model isn't built on churning cardholders. It's built on relationships. Longevity, prestige. Which is why the first real question here isn't about money. It's about breakdown. Something stopped working, and whatever stopped working couldn't be fixed quietly anymore. The filing itself, stripped of speculation, does not read like an accusation hurled at a public figure. It reads like a system asserting its boundaries. That distinction matters because systems don't care about reputation. They care about compliance, and compliance is where things get interesting. The visible portions of the document outline a dispute connected to charges accumulated over time. Not a single purchase, not a one-off event, a pattern. Patterns are where legal disputes shift from misunderstanding to scrutiny. But patterns don't imply intent. They imply repetition. And repetition invites questions about oversight. Who was monitoring the account? Who was reconciling statements? Who was authorized to intervene? In high net worth arrangements, those answers are rarely straightforward. Accounts are often tied to multiple uses. Personal expenses blend with professional obligations. Advisors act on behalf of principals. Staff execute purchases without direct oversight. And all of that is perfectly legal, until something isn't. When disputes arise, the first phase is internal. Charges are flagged, clarifications are requested, documentation is exchanged. Most disputes die there. This one didn't, which suggests that the responses, whatever they were, did not satisfy the issuer's thresholds. That doesn't mean wrongdoing, it means unresolved disagreement. And unresolved disagreement is where litigation begins to feel inevitable. Here's something most viewers never hear. Financial institutions don't file lawsuits because they're angry. They file because a calculation tipped. Risk, recovery, precedent. If a dispute reaches a point where letting it slide becomes more expensive than pursuing it, the system moves. And once it moves, it doesn't move emotionally. It moves mechanically. The filing reflects that. No adjectives, no dramatic language, no commentary on character. Just assertions tied to contracts, which brings us to a critical element, the contract itself. Credit card agreements are not casual documents. They are dense, specific, unforgiving. Authorization clauses are especially rigid. They define who can spend, under what conditions, with what responsibility. And those clauses are where most high-value disputes live or die. Because authorization is not static. It can be expanded, delegated, revoked. And if those changes aren't perfectly documented, ambiguity creeps in. Ambiguity is where disputes thrive. From the outside, it can look baffling. How could anyone not know who was authorized? How could millions accumulate without intervention? But inside complex financial ecosystems, it happens more often than people think. Not because of malice, because of assumption. Someone assumes someone else is watching. Someone assumes the account is being reconciled. Someone assumes approval was granted. Until someone checks. And then the assumptions collapse. What's striking about this case isn't just the amount allegedly in dispute, it's the apparent duration. Time stretches disputes. The longer something goes unaddressed, the harder it is to unwind. That's why timing matters. When did concerns first surface? When were they escalated? When did resolution attempts stall? Those answers aren't fully public yet. But the filing itself implies a process that unfolded over time, not overnight, which complicates the narrative. Because sudden scandals are easy to digest. Slow-moving breakdowns are harder. They force audiences to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. That discomfort is already visible in how this story is being framed in early coverage. Some outlets lean heavily on the number. Others focus on the name. Very few focus on the mechanism. But the mechanism is the story. Because mechanisms tell us whether this is about miscommunication, mismanagement, or something else entirely. And right now, the mechanism is partially obscured. Which brings us to silence. Public figures often respond quickly to allegations, especially when they believe clarity is on their side. Here, the absence of immediate commentary has been noticeable. That doesn't imply guilt. It implies calculation. Legal teams rarely rush statements in the early stages of litigation. Every word becomes part of the record. Every phrase can be revisited later. Sometimes silence is the safest move. But silence also creates vacuum. And vacuums get filled with speculation, with assumptions, with narrative shortcuts. That's why responsible coverage has to slow down rather than speed up, and slowing down reveals something else. The filing is not the end of a story. It's the start of a process. A process that can unfold in multiple directions. Settlement, dismissal, escalation, discovery. Each path tells a different story. And each path carries different implications for reputation. Because even when disputes are resolved quietly, the existence of a filing changes how institutions assess risk going forward. Creditworthiness isn't just about payment history. It's about predictability. Disputes introduce unpredictability, and unpredictability has consequences that linger long after court dates pass. This is where the story intersects with something broader: public trust. For years, discussions around the Sussexes have revolved around credibility, media narratives, competing truths, allegations of misrepresentation from multiple sides. This filing doesn't confirm or deny any of that, but it enters that conversation whether anyone wants it to or not. Because financial disputes are binary in a way public narratives aren't. Either documentation supports authorization or it doesn't. Either agreements were followed or they weren't. Either resolution was achieved or it failed. There's very little room for interpretation, which is why institutions prefer to resolve these matters quietly. Public exposure limits flexibility. So again, the question returns: why here? Why now? The filing doesn't answer that explicitly, but its existence suggests that the threshold for discretion was crossed. That's not a judgment, it's an inference based on how systems behave. And systems behave predictably, which means if we follow the system, rather than the headlines, we get closer to understanding what's actually happening. Next, that means looking closely at the account structure itself. Not the charges, not the total, the structure. Who the account was designed for, how it was intended to be used, what safeguards were in place. Because before any court considers numbers, it considers design. And inside that design lies a detail that reframes the entire dispute, not emotionally, but legally. A detail that doesn't scream scandal. It whispers responsibility, and once you hear it, it's impossible to ignore. There's a reason American Express cases don't usually end up in court. It's not because disputes never happen. They do, constantly, even at the highest levels. It's because the entire architecture of the company is designed to prevent escalation long before anyone files anything. American Express doesn't operate like a mass market lender. It never has. Its business model is built around selectivity, long-term relationships, and a level of discretion that appeals to people who don't want friction showing up in public places. That discretion is not accidental. High-value cardholders are assigned account managers, not call centers, managers. People whose job is to keep problems from becoming visible, to absorb tension, to negotiate, to smooth over misunderstandings quietly. Which is why litigation is considered a failure state, not a moral failure, a systems failure. So when a dispute involving American Express becomes public, experienced observers don't ask who's wrong. They ask what broke, because something always breaks first. Usually it's trust, but trust isn't an emotional concept in this context. It's operational. Trust means the institution believes discrepancies will be resolved without formal enforcement. Once that belief disappears, the tone changes. You can often see that shift before a lawsuit is filed. Language hardens. Deadlines appear. Courtesy gives way to compliance. And eventually, documentation replaces conversation. The reason that matters here is because of how rare this path is for American Express. They prefer settlement. They prefer arbitration. They prefer silence. Public court filings expose more than just numbers. They expose internal processes, risk assessments, sometimes even past decisions. Institutions avoid that unless the alternative is worse, which suggests that whatever resolution attempts were made behind the scenes did not reach a point both sides could live with. That doesn't imply refusal. It doesn't imply deception. It implies impasse, and impasse is dangerous territory, especially when accounts involve multiple layers of use. Because American Express accounts tied to high-profile individuals often don't look like standard consumer accounts. They're structured. They can be linked to business entities. They can support organizational expenses. They can authorize multiple users under a single primary agreement. Each of those features increases flexibility, and each increases complexity. Flexibility is convenient when things are going smoothly. Complexity becomes a liability when something goes wrong. That's why authorization rules are the backbone of these agreements. Authorization is not just about who has a card. It's about who has responsibility, and those two things are not always the same. For example, an assistant may be authorized to make purchases, but not to approve budgets. An advisor may authorize categories, but not transactions. An organization may cover expenses, but not personal overages. All of this is spelt out in contracts that few people read carefully once the relationship is established, because relationships breed comfort. Comfort breeds assumption. And assumption is where disputes grow. When American Express reviews a disputed account, the first thing they don't look at is the total. They look at the structure. Who was listed as the primary account holder? Who were authorized users? What categories were permitted? What internal notes exist? Because internal notes matter more than people realize. Every interaction with a financial institution leaves a trace. Calls are logged. Emails are summarized. Requests are recorded, not verbatim, but enough to establish a timeline. Those timelines become crucial once a dispute escalates. They tell the story of who said what, when, and in what context. Which brings us to something subtle in this case. The escalation appears to have been methodical. Not sudden, not reactionary. Methodical escalation suggests prolonged disagreement rather than a single breaking point. That distinction changes how the dispute is interpreted. A single event might point to confusion. A prolonged breakdown suggests incompatible expectations. That's where things get uncomfortable. Because incompatible expectations often stem from mismatched assumptions about responsibility. Who believed they were covered? Who believed someone else was accountable? Who believed the issue would resolve itself? These questions are rarely answered cleanly. And they're rarely asked publicly. But court filings force them into the open. That's one reason institutions hesitate. Once the dispute is formalized, nuance disappears. Contracts replace conversations, and contracts are unforgiving. American Express contracts, in particular, are explicit about liability. Authorized use does not equal shared responsibility, unless explicitly stated, which means that in many cases, responsibility defaults upward to the primary holder. That reality often surprises people who operate in large teams. They assume delegation equals distribution of risk. Legally, it often doesn't, and that's where even sophisticated clients can find themselves exposed. Not because they intended to misuse anything, because systems don't care about intent. They care about structure. That structural reality is what makes this case notable. Not the celebrity angle, the structure. Because if the dispute centers on authorization boundaries, it becomes less about behavior and more about design. And design failures are harder to explain away. They don't respond to apologies or narratives, they respond to documentation. That's why the next phase of a case like this often focuses on the contract history. Were amendments made? Were authorizations updated? Were limits adjusted? Each modification tells a story, and each omission tells a different one. What makes American Express disputes especially revealing is that their internal tolerance thresholds are well known in the industry. They allow flexibility. They allow negotiation. But they do not allow indefinite ambiguity. At some point, ambiguity becomes risk, and risk triggers action. That's when legal teams step in, not to punish, to contain. Containment is the goal of litigation from an institutional perspective. Contain financial exposure. Contain precedent. Contain uncertainty. Which brings us to another uncomfortable reality. Once a case enters court, settlement dynamics change. Positions harden. Options narrow. Even if both sides want resolution, the process itself creates momentum. Momentum that can carry cases further than anyone initially intended. That's why so many disputes settle just before key deadlines, because everyone involved recognizes the cost of continued exposure. But before settlement can happen, leverage matters. And leverage is influenced by public perception, which is where this case becomes particularly sensitive. Public figures don't litigate in a vacuum. Every filing is interpreted through the lens of reputation. Every silence is analyzed. Every delay is questioned. That pressure can push parties toward resolution or deeper conflict. And institutions are aware of that. They don't ignore it. They account for it. Which is why the decision to file publicly signals that reputational considerations were weighed and accepted. That alone tells us something. It suggests the institution believed its position was defensible enough to withstand scrutiny. That doesn't mean it's right. It means it's confident. Confidence at that level is not casual. Which brings us back to the original question. Why is this rare? Because American Express prefers to avoid exactly this scenario. They prefer discretion over disclosure. So when disclosure happens, it's because discretion stopped being viable. And discretion stops being viable when trust erodes. Not trust in a person, trust in a process. Something about the dispute likely indicated that resolution would not be straightforward, that future compliance might be uncertain, that precedent might be set either way, and precedent is something institutions fear. If one high-profile case is handled inconsistently, others follow. That's why consistency becomes paramount. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's public. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into headlines, because it doesn't fit neatly into blame. It lives in systems, and systems don't tell satisfying stories. They tell revealing ones, which is why understanding how American Express operates changes how this case should be interpreted. Not as an emotional clash, not as an instant judgment, but as a procedural escalation triggered by unresolved structural issues. And those issues don't disappear quietly. They surface, usually in filings. And once surfaced, they invite scrutiny not just of behavior, but of how the account itself was built. Who designed it? Who managed it? Who monitored it? Those answers matter more than any headline, because they determine where responsibility ultimately rests. How it was set up, who it was meant to serve, and what happens when design assumptions collide with legal reality. Because once we understand the account structure, the dispute stops being abstract. It becomes specific. And specificity changes everything. The number is what catches people first. $2.3 million. It sits there on the page, inert and heavy, doing what large numbers always do, pulling attention away from everything else. Because numbers feel definitive, clean, final. But in legal disputes, numbers are rarely the truth. They're the surface. And the danger of focusing on the surface too early is that you miss what the number is actually doing in the story. Because this figure isn't just a total, it's an accumulation. A product of time, structure, and unresolved assumptions. That distinction matters more than most people realize. When large sums appear suddenly in the public record, the instinct is to imagine a moment, a spree, a decision, a line crossed. But disputes of this size almost never come from moments. They come from drift. Slow, incremental drift that goes unnoticed until it's too large to ignore. And that's where this case begins to feel less sensational and more unsettling. Because drift implies oversight gaps, not one mistake. Many small ones, not intent. Inattention, not drama. Process failure. Let's slow this down. Credit card balances don't jump to 7 figures overnight, especially not on accounts tied to elite issuers with layered controls. They climb, statement by statement, charge by charge, month by month, which raises an obvious but rarely asked question: where was the friction? At what point did this stop feeling routine? Because friction is built into financial systems for a reason. Limits, alerts, reviews. They exist to interrupt drift. So if a disputed balance reaches this level, one of two things usually happened. Either friction was intentionally relaxed, or it failed. Both scenarios tell different stories. Relaxed friction suggests trust, long-standing relationship, confidence that issues would be addressed eventually. Failed friction suggests misalignment, systems not talking to each other, responsibilities blurred. Neither implies wrongdoing, but both imply vulnerability. And vulnerability is what litigation exploits. Now here's where the nuance deepens. $2.3 million is not a single category of spending. It's not a single purpose. At that level, charges span categories: travel, services, logistics, professional expenses, personal expenditures. And in complex financial ecosystems, those categories overlap. A flight might be business-related. A hotel might serve multiple purposes. A consultant might work across roles. The question becomes, how were those categories classified? Because classification is the backbone of dispute resolution. If charges are categorized as business expenses, they may be reimbursable by an entity. If they're personal, responsibility shifts. If they're mixed, interpretation enters the picture. And interpretation is where disputes harden. From the outside, it's tempting to ask why anyone would allow that ambiguity. But ambiguity is often the price of convenience. High-profile individuals operate at speed. They rely on teams. They rely on delegation. They rely on systems designed to keep things moving. The assumption is that someone is always reconciling. But reconciliation is invisible work. And invisible work is easy to assume away, until the numbers force it into view. Another uncomfortable reality is this. Large balances don't always trigger alarm because of the balance itself. They trigger alarm when something changes. A missed communication, a delayed response, a disagreement over classification. Sometimes the dispute isn't about the total, it's about a portion. And once a portion is contested, the entire balance becomes unstable. That's when negotiations stall. That's when positions entrench. And that's when legal action becomes an option rather than a threat. Which brings us back to the figure. $2.3 million may represent the disputed portion, or it may represent the exposure at the time of filing. Those are not the same thing. But headlines don't distinguish between them, and neither does public imagination. That's why careful analysis matters here, because the number is doing narrative work it wasn't designed to do. It's becoming a proxy for judgment, when in reality, it's a data point. A large one, a consequential one, but not a conclusion. In financial disputes, totals often include charges under review, charges pending clarification, and charges subject to offset. That complexity disappears once litigation begins. The court doesn't ask how it feels. It asks what the contract says, and contracts don't care about optics. They care about allocation. Who bears responsibility for what, and under which circumstances? This is where many viewers start asking a different question. How could this go unnoticed? It's a fair question, but it assumes a level of centralized control that doesn't always exist. In large operations, financial oversight is distributed. One person authorizes, another executes, another reconciles, another reviews. Each role depends on the others, and if even one link weakens, drift accelerates. Add public pressure, constant travel, shifting organizational structures, and the potential for misalignment grows. This isn't unique to public figures, but public figures feel the consequences differently. Because once disputes surface, they're reframed as personal failures rather than systemic ones. That reframing is powerful and often misleading. The truth is, systems fail quietly, and litigation is loud failure. Another detail worth sitting with is how totals are presented in filings. They're not storytelling tools, they're leverage markers. They establish scope. They define stakes. They tell the court how much is at issue, not why it happened. The why comes later. Often much later, which means early reactions are almost always premature. Yet early reactions shape everything that follows. That's the paradox. The public forms conclusions before the process has even begun. And those conclusions create pressure. Pressure on parties, pressure on institutions, pressure on reputations, which can influence strategy. Silence becomes safer. And once silence sets in, speculation fills the space. That's already happening here. Some voices frame the number as evidence of excess. Others frame it as misunderstanding. Both positions assume facts not yet established. Because the number alone doesn't tell us who authorized what. It doesn't tell us who believed what. It doesn't tell us when concerns were raised. And it certainly doesn't tell us how those concerns were handled. All of that lies elsewhere, in communications, in logs, in amendments. Which brings us to a subtler point. Large disputed amounts often include fees, interest, penalties, adjustments. Those components can inflate totals dramatically over time. And once litigation begins, those components are frozen into the record. That doesn't mean they're final. It means they're asserted. Assertion is not adjudication. But again, the public rarely distinguishes between the two. Which raises a deeper question. Is the number the story, or is it the distraction? Because focusing on the total can obscure the mechanism that produced it. And the mechanism is what determines outcome. Courts don't care how shocking a number feels. They care how it formed. Was it permitted? Was it disclosed? Was it contested? Was it addressed? Those questions decide liability, not shock, not outrage, not disbelief. This is where the story begins to resist simplification. Because if the dispute centers on process rather than behavior, it becomes harder to assign moral clarity. And moral clarity is what audiences crave. But real investigations rarely deliver it cleanly. They deliver complexity. Which brings us back to timing. When did the total reach this level? Was there a point where intervention could have prevented escalation? Did any party believe the dispute was already resolved? Those questions matter more than the number itself, because they tell us whether this was a sudden rupture or a slow breakdown. And slow breakdowns implicate more than one decision. They implicate systems. That's uncomfortable, because systems don't have faces. They can't apologize. They can't explain themselves. They just produce outcomes. And those outcomes land on individuals, especially individuals in the public eye. This is where the emotional tension in this story lives. Not in accusations, in contradiction. The contradiction between how seamless elite financial life appears and how fragile it actually is behind the scenes. The contradiction between control and dependence, between visibility and vulnerability, between reputation and paperwork. And the paperwork doesn't bend. It doesn't respond to narratives, it responds to clauses, which means that as this case moves forward, the number will matter less than the explanations attached to it. Explanations that haven't surfaced yet, but they will. Because litigation forces disclosure, even when parties resist. And when those disclosures begin, the story will shift again, from totals to timelines, from shock to specificity, from speculation to structure. And the structure is where the next chapter takes us, because before any court weighs the number, it weighs something else. Authorization. Who had it? How it was defined? And what happened when its boundaries were tested? That's where this dispute stops being about how much and starts being about who. And once we follow that thread, the story becomes far more precise and far more consequential. Authorization is a quiet word. It doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't trigger instinctive reactions the way words like fraud or lawsuit do. But in financial disputes, authorization is everything. It's the hinge the entire door swings on. Because courts don't ask whether spending felt reasonable, they don't ask whether it aligned with lifestyle or public expectations. They ask one question over and over in slightly different forms. Who was authorized to do what? And that question is far more complicated than it appears. Most people imagine authorization as a binary switch, yes or no, allowed or forbidden, card or no card. In reality, especially at the upper end of financial structures, authorization exists on a spectrum. There is transactional authorization. There is categorical authorization. There is implied authorization. And each one behaves differently under legal pressure. Transactional authorization is the simplest. A specific charge. A specific approval. Clean. Traceable. Categorical authorization is broader. It allows spending within defined areas. Travel. Consulting. Operations. The assumption is that the details will be reconciled later. Delegated authorization allows someone else to act on behalf of the principal. Assistants. Managers. Staff. People trusted to execute, not decide. Implied authorization is the most dangerous of all. It's not written clearly, it's inferred. It grows out of habit and precedent, and implied authorization is where many disputes are born. Because implied authorization works, until it doesn't. When everything is running smoothly, no one questions it. Charges flow. Statements are paid. No alarms are triggered, but when something changes, a missed payment, a dispute over classification, a review triggered by volume, implied authorization collapses. Suddenly, everyone wants documentation, and implied authorization rarely leaves paper trails. This is where elite accounts become vulnerable, not because they're abused, but because they're built on trust. Trust that teams will operate within understood boundaries. Trust that someone is always watching. Trust that problems will be flagged early. That trust is efficient. It's also brittle. Now, in disputes involving high-profile individuals, authorization takes on an additional layer. Public figures often operate across multiple domains simultaneously. Personal life, professional commitments, public-facing organizations, private foundations. Expenses move across those domains fluidly. A trip might be part personal, part professional. A service might support both public engagement and private logistics. Categorization becomes interpretive. And interpretation is the enemy of clean authorization. Because once interpretation enters the picture, disagreement becomes possible. And once disagreement persists, escalation becomes likely. This is why American Express, and institutions like it, document authorization so aggressively. Not to restrict clients, but to protect themselves. Every authorized user is logged. Every role is defined. Every change is supposed to be recorded. But even robust systems rely on accurate updates. And updates depend on communication. If a role changes and the system isn't updated, ambiguity forms. If responsibilities shift and no one formalizes it, gaps appear. And gaps are where disputes grow. This is why one of the most important questions in this case isn't who spent the money. It's who is supposed to be watching. Oversight is a form of authorization. The absence of oversight is not neutral. It has consequences. In legal terms, oversight failures don't automatically absolve responsibility. Often, they concentrate it. because the primary account holder is presumed to bear ultimate responsibility unless the contract explicitly says otherwise. That presumption surprises many people, especially people used to operating in teams, but contracts don't care about team dynamics. They care about signatures. Which brings us to a subtle but critical tension. In public narratives, delegation is often framed as empowerment. In legal narratives, delegation can be framed as risk. If an assistant makes a purchase within perceived authority, but that authority isn't documented properly, the institution doesn't pursue the assistant. It pursues the account. And the account points back to the primary holder. This isn't personal, it's structural. And that structure doesn't bend easily. Now, consider how this plays out emotionally. From the perspective of a public figure, it can feel unfair. They didn't personally swipe the card. They didn't personally approve every transaction. They relied on professionals. But reliance is not a defense unless the contract recognizes it, which is why authorization disputes often feel shocking to the people involved. They collide with assumptions about how responsibility should work, and legal systems don't resolve assumptions kindly. They resolve them by pointing to clauses that are rarely read after the account is opened. This is why many high-value disputes center on what was understood versus what was documented. And understanding doesn't carry legal weight. Documentation does. In this case, the filing suggests that authorization boundaries are central, not behavior, not motive. Boundaries. Where did authorization begin? Where did it end? And when did those boundaries blur? Those are not moral questions. They are contractual ones, which means the answers won't be found in interviews or public statements. They'll be found in account histories, in internal notes, in amendments and addenda. Those materials aren't public yet. But their existence is implied by the escalation itself, because institutions don't escalate without reviewing authorization first. That's step one. If authorization is clear, disputes resolve quickly. If it's ambiguous, they don't. Ambiguity invites interpretation. Interpretation invites disagreement. Disagreement invites lawyers. Which brings us to another uncomfortable truth. Authorization disputes are often about power, not spending. Who had the power to say yes? Who had the power to say no? Who believed they had that power? Misalignment between perceived power and documented power creates conflict. And that conflict doesn't always emerge immediately. It can simmer until a trigger exposes it. That trigger could be a review, a staffing change, a financial audit, a change in payment patterns. We don't know yet what the trigger was here, but something forced a closer look. And closer looks are rarely forgiving. When institutions scrutinize authorization histories, they don't just look at who was authorized at the end. They look at the evolution. Who was added when? Who was removed? Who changed roles? Those timelines matter, because if authorization changed without proper updates, responsibility can become murky. Murky responsibility is poison in litigation. Courts hate ambiguity. They resolve it by defaulting to the clearest contractual position, and the clearest position is often the one least favorable to individuals relying on informal arrangements. That's why many legal advisors warn high-profile clients to formalize everything, not because they expect disputes, because disputes arise when informality meets scale. Scale magnifies consequences. A small ambiguity at low volumes is manageable. At high volumes, it becomes existential. This is where the $2.3 million figure becomes less shocking and more explanatory. It suggests scale, and scale exposes weaknesses. Weaknesses in oversight. Weaknesses in documentation. Those weaknesses don't imply bad faith, they imply complexity. But courts don't adjudicate complexity gently. Which brings us to another layer. Authorization isn't just about who can spend, it's about who can resolve disputes. Who had the authority to challenge charges? Who communicated with the institution? Who responded when concerns were raised? If responses were delayed or inconsistent, that matters, not morally. Legally, because delays can be interpreted as acceptance. Silence can be interpreted as acquiescence. Again, not because it's fair, because contracts are written that way. This is why legal teams often take over communication early in disputes. They want to control interpretation. They want to ensure that every response aligns with the contractual position. But taking over communication also slows things down, and delays can harden positions, which creates a paradox. Act quickly and risk saying the wrong thing. Weight and risk being seen as unresponsive. That tension is likely present here. And it explains the public silence. Silence isn't absence. It's restraint. But restraint has costs. Because while one side stays quiet, the system keeps moving. Deadlines approach, options narrow, and once a filing is made, the dispute changes shape. Authorization questions move from internal review to public record. And once public, they invite interpretation far beyond their original context. That's the risk institutions accept when they file, which suggests they believe the authorization question favors them. Not conclusively, but sufficiently. This is where many viewers will feel a pull toward judgment. It's natural. Authorization sounds technical. Technical sounds boring. Boring invites simplification. But simplification distorts reality. The reality is that authorization disputes are among the most complex financial conflicts. They require unpacking roles, expectations, and documentation across time. They resist easy narratives, and that resistance is precisely why this story is unfolding. Because slow stories are the ones that change perception, fast stories burn out. Slow ones linger. And the authorization question here is not going away. It will shape every next step. Discovery, settlement talks, public statements. All of it hinges on who is authorized and how clearly. And once that becomes the focal point, attention shifts again, away from spending, toward oversight. Because authorization without oversight is meaningless, and oversight without documentation is fragile. Which brings us to the next layer of this case. Oversight isn't just about watching numbers. It's about systems designed to catch drift. Alerts, limits, reviews. Those systems exist for a reason. And when they don't interrupt escalation, it raises questions not just about spending, but about monitoring. Who was responsible for monitoring this account? What safeguards were in place? And why didn't they stop this from reaching litigation? Those questions don't accuse. They interrogate design. And design failures implicate more than individuals. They implicate processes. Processes that are about to come under scrutiny. Because once authorization is questioned, oversight is next. And oversight failures, when documented, can reframe an entire dispute. That's where the story is heading. Toward the systems that were supposed to prevent this. And the moment we examine those systems, a new contradiction emerges. One that challenges assumptions about control, competence, and responsibility. Because if the account was authorized properly, why wasn't it controlled? And if it wasn't controlled, who failed to act? Those questions don't have comfortable answers, but they're coming. And when they do, they will change how this dispute is understood, not as a question of spending, but as a question of supervision. And supervision is where the stakes rise again. Because supervision failures don't just affect one account, they affect credibility. And credibility, once questioned, is difficult to restore, especially when the paperwork tells a different story. Silence is never empty. It just looks that way from the outside. In legal disputes, especially ones that touch public figures, silence is often the loudest move on the board. Not because it explains anything, but because it withholds explanation at the exact moment people expect it. That's what makes this phase of the story uncomfortable. After the filing became visible, there was no immediate clarification, no statement walking the public through the basics, no framing of the dispute as routine, no attempt to get ahead of interpretation. Just nothing. And that absence matters, not because it proves anything, it doesn't, but because it changes how the story breathes. When information is withheld, attention sharpens. Every detail is scrutinized harder. Every phrase in the filing is reread. Every comma starts to feel intentional. This is the paradox of high-profile silence. It protects legally, but it inflames narratively. Legal teams know this. They accept it, often reluctantly. Because from a legal standpoint, early commentary is risk. Every word becomes discoverable. Every explanation can be contradicted later. Every clarification can box you in. From a narrative standpoint, however, silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums never stay empty. They fill with speculation, with assumptions, with other people's interpretations. That's already happening here. Some observers interpret silence as confidence. Others read it as avoidance. Still others assume it's temporary, a pause before a strategic response. All of those interpretations can coexist. None of them are definitive, but they all shape perception. And perception matters even in disputes that will ultimately be resolved on paper rather than in public opinion. This is where public figures face a unique problem. Private individuals can afford to let legal processes unfold quietly. Their reputations aren't constantly negotiated in real time. Public figures don't have that luxury. Every delay is noticed. Every non-response is analyzed. Every silence is framed, which makes restraint both necessary and costly. This is why silence in cases like this should be understood as a choice, not an absence, a calculated one. And that calculation usually looks something like this. Say nothing early because early facts are incomplete. Avoid locking into a narrative before discovery. Prevent statements from being used out of context later. Those are sound legal instincts. But they collide with media reality because media timelines don't align with legal timelines. The public doesn't wait for discovery. Commentators don't wait for motions. Headlines don't wait for nuance. They move immediately, which means silence allows others to set the frame. That's risky. But speaking too early is riskier. This tension is likely driving the current posture, and it tells us something important. The dispute is being taken seriously. This isn't being treated as a misunderstanding that can be waved away with a sentence or two. It's being treated as a matter where precision matters, where every explanation has consequences, which suggests the underlying issues are not simple. If the facts were clean and easily summarized, silence wouldn't be necessary. A brief statement could contextualize the dispute and calm speculation. The absence of that suggests complexity, not guilt. Complexity. Complexity that requires careful handling. That complexity likely lives in the details we've already been circling. Authorization, oversight, classification. Those aren't things you explain in a soundbite. They require context, and context takes time that legal teams often try to buy by staying quiet. But while one side stays quiet, the other side moves. Institutions don't pause their processes because of public perception. Deadlines still apply. Procedures still advance. The filing itself triggers a sequence. Responses must be prepared. Arguments structured. Positions formalized. That work happens out of view, which can create the illusion of inactivity. But inactivity is rarely what's happening. More often, the opposite is true. Activity intensifies behind the scenes. Legal teams assemble timelines. They reconstruct communication histories. They review internal records. Every decision that led to this point is examined, not to justify it publicly, but to defend it contractually. And that work often reveals uncomfortable truths. Not about wrongdoing. Misalignment between what people believed was happening and what documentation supports. That misalignment is the danger zone. Because once discovered, it can't be undiscovered. And if legal teams are still mapping that terrain, speaking publicly would be premature. This helps explain why silence is sometimes prolonged, not because there's nothing to say, because there's too much to say, and saying it prematurely could weaken the eventual position. Another layer here is coordination. Public figures rarely speak alone in disputes like this. Statements are coordinated with advisors, institutions, insurers, and sometimes other stakeholders. Each party has its own interest. Those interests don't always align perfectly, which slows messaging. One party may want to reassure. Another may want to withhold. Another may want to emphasize process. Reconciling those preferences takes time, especially when the dispute involves financial structures tied to multiple domains: personal, professional, organizational. A statement that satisfies one domain might complicate another. That's another reason silence can feel safer in the short term. But short-term safety can create long-term narrative drift, because as silence stretches, stories harden. Early speculation becomes accepted context, and once that happens, correcting it later becomes harder. This is why some legal strategists favor a different approach. They issue narrow procedural statements, not explanations, not defenses, just acknowledgments. Something like, "The matter is under review, we're cooperating. No further comment." Even that hasn't happened here, which suggests the calculus leans heavily toward restraint, and that restraint hints at something else. Uncertainty. Not uncertainty about outcome, but uncertainty about framing. How do you explain a dispute rooted in structure without oversimplifying it? How do you address a number without validating its narrative weight? How do you clarify authorization boundaries without exposing internal processes? Those are difficult questions, and they don't have elegant answers, Which brings us back to American Express. Institutions like American Express don't comment publicly on active litigation either. They let filings speak. That mutual silence creates a strange dynamic. Two powerful entities saying nothing, while everyone else talks. That asymmetry amplifies speculation, and speculation thrives on gaps. Gaps in information, gaps in explanation, gaps in response. Which is why this phase of the story feels tense, even though very little is happening publicly. Tension doesn't require action. It requires anticipation. And anticipation is built when people sense that something is unresolved. This dispute is unresolved. That much is clear. What's less clear is how resolution will be pursued. Will there be settlement talks? Will motions be filed? Will discovery expand the record? Those decisions haven't surfaced yet. But silence suggests deliberation, not avoidance. And deliberation often precedes escalation or resolution. Either way, something changes. Silence rarely persists indefinitely in cases like this. Eventually, someone breaks it, either through a filing, through a motion, through a negotiated outcome. When that happens, the narrative shifts. But until then, the silence itself becomes part of the story. It invites interpretation. It invites doubt. It invites questions that don't have answers yet. And unanswered questions are sticky. They linger in the public mind. They shape how subsequent information is received. Which is why this phase matters. Not because of what's said, because of what isn't. The absence of explanation forces us back to the documents, to the filings, to the structures, to the systems. And systems, unlike people, don't speak. They leave traces. Those traces are what investigators follow. Not interviews, not rumors, not reactions, paper, logs, timelines, authorizations. That's where clarity eventually emerges. But clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments. And the next fragment in this case isn't a statement, it's another document. Another piece of the record that shifts attention away from silence and towards substance. Because silence can only hold the narrative for so long. Sooner or later, paperwork takes over. And when it does, the questions stop being abstract. They become specific. What was disputed? When was it disputed? How was it handled? Those answers don't care about public posture. They care about chronology. And chronology is where the story tightens. Because once we lay out the timeline, patterns appear. Not assumptions. Patterns. And patterns change how disputes are understood. That's where we're headed next. Away from silence. Toward sequence, toward the order of events that led from private friction to public filing. Because once we reconstruct that sequence, the dispute stops feeling mysterious. It starts feeling inevitable. And inevitability reframes responsibility in ways that are difficult to ignore. By now, it's clear that numbers and silence alone don't tell the story. What matters is what the documents themselves reveal. And just as important, what they don't. Public filings are deceptively minimalist. They are precise, cold, carefully neutral. They list charges, outline disputed amounts, and cite contractual clauses, but they rarely explain motivation, context, or intent. That's by design. The purpose is to preserve the institution's position, not to provide a narrative satisfying to public curiosity. And that's where much of the early confusion emerges. People read numbers, draw conclusions, and fill in blanks with assumptions. Here's the thing about omissions. They are loud. They signal absence, and absence becomes speculation. The filing indicates disputed charges, the sum total, and some procedural background. But what it does not show, at least in the publicly accessible portions, is the chain of communication. When disputes were first raised, who responded, and what records were exchanged. Those missing pieces are critical because they shape how responsibility is assigned and interpreted. For example, if a charge was questioned internally but documentation was delayed, it may appear as though no action was taken. If notes between an account manager and the account holder were misfiled or not reflected in official records, it could create a perception that oversight failed. In high-value accounts, perception can become reality, at least in legal argumentation. And yet, it's important to note, the filings themselves do not allege misconduct. They outline a disagreement over responsibility, supported by contractual references. That's subtle, but essential. Misinterpret it as accusation, and the narrative immediately becomes skewed. A technical dispute becomes sensationalized. And that is exactly the point where public and legal narratives diverge. Another thing filings reveal is the role of intermediaries. Large accounts often operate through multiple channels. Assistants, advisors, or financial managers may handle day-to-day spending. In some cases, authorized users make purchases that the primary account holder may not directly see or approve in real time. This is where redactions and missing details play an outsized role. Every redacted section in a filing hints at sensitive information, likely names, internal correspondence, or procedural notes, that cannot yet be publicly disclosed. Each blank space provokes speculation because the mind instinctively fills gaps. Who wrote that note? Who authorized that transaction? Which department handled it? These are not idle questions. They influence how a court might interpret responsibility. Timing is another subtle yet crucial aspect revealed indirectly by the filing. Charges appear across months or even years. Dates of authorization, notices of dispute, and responses create a timeline that can be cross-examined against when the filing was ultimately made. And that timeline, when reconstructed, often uncovers patterns, delays, oversights, or repeated points of friction that escalate a minor disagreement into a formal dispute. It's worth pausing to consider that these patterns don't inherently imply wrongdoing. What they do imply is opportunity for misalignment. A system is only as robust as the communication and documentation that support it. Gaps in that system are vulnerabilities. And when vulnerabilities reach a critical point, escalation is often inevitable. Yet, despite the structured nature of filings, context is everything. A dispute of this magnitude might involve categories of charges that blur personal and professional lines. Travel could be business-related, but the associated expenses might also carry personal elements. Services could be engaged for foundation work, yet overlap with personal logistics. Without careful parsing, it becomes easy to misinterpret the situation. The filings also highlight the role of institutional thresholds. American Express, like other high-value financial institutions, has internal mechanisms to determine when a dispute is elevated to litigation. Those thresholds consider not just the total disputed amount, but also patterns of activity, previous resolutions, and potential risk to precedent. When those thresholds are crossed, escalation is no longer discretionary, it becomes procedural. And that procedural escalation is critical to understand. From the institution's perspective, this is not an emotional judgment. It is a matter of process. The filing exists to assert position and define scope. Its language is deliberately neutral to minimize liability and avoid creating unintended admissions. That's why, to the untrained eye, it may feel opaque or evasive. But to those familiar with institutional practice, it's